Today is 4.1, and we're going to talk about the advantages and disadvantages of the American Revolution. We're going to talk about Fort Ticonderoga, and we're going to talk about the Battle of Bunker Hill. So let's review. Okay, who made the Midnight Ride? That's Paul Revere. Paul Revere made the Midnight Ride to warn the towns of Lexington and Concord that the British are coming. The British wanted to arrest Patriot leaders in Lexington and find hidden weapons in Concord. The American Revolution began in Lexington when someone fired the shot heard around the world. The battles of Lexington and Concord were a draw, but the Minutemen did most of their damage as the Redcoats marched back to Boston. So first we're going to talk about the advantages of the Americans, the advantages that they have when fighting the Redcoats. We have fighting for freedom. So they're not fighting just because they have to. The Redcoats, they're having to fight because they're told to fight, and they're fighting for a paycheck. The Americans, many of them are volunteers. They're not getting paid at all, but they're fighting for freedom. They're fighting for something much more than just a paycheck. And so they have more motivation to fight, more motivation to win. If the Redcoats win, they don't gain anything. They don't gain anything more. They just get their paycheck. That's it. So they don't have a lot to fight for. Home field advantage. So the Americans get to sleep in their own beds. They know the land better, the terrain better than the British, because the British, they are not here full time. These Redcoats get shipped over from England or come in from Canada, and they don't know the terrain very well. And they're also sleeping in houses of strangers. Better rifles. So the French are going to send rifles from France to the colonies. And these rifles are going to be better than the British. They're going to have the bullet's going to be a little smaller, the lead ball. So it's going to have more range. It can shoot farther, and it has better accuracy than the rifles or the muskets that the British will use. And then the Americans also have the French and Indian War experience. So they were able to fight alongside the British Redcoats in the French and Indian War. And so the U.S., they know the Redcoats, their strengths and their weaknesses. And that's going to really help them out in fighting this Revolutionary War. The disadvantages. The Americans have a weak army, especially compared to the Redcoats. Their army lacked training and discipline. They were taken from their homes, handed a gun, and they were told to kill without much training in the field. There's no money for soldiers, so even though they've agreed to create a Continental Army led by George Washington, they have no money to pay the soldiers. Therefore, many men deserted the army. They were able to come and go as they wanted, and no one was able to make being a soldier their full-time job because they were not getting paid. The government, or the acting government, the Continental Congress, were basically saying that they would hand out IOUs, which, I will pay you later type of deal. And so if you're a farmer and it's time to plant your crops, you're going to leave the army and go home and plant crops. And then you'll come back and fight. And when it's time to harvest your crops, you're going to go back and harvest your crops because you still have to make money for your family because the government had no way of making money. They could not tax. And so the government was not able, the Continental Congress was not able to pay the soldiers. Lack of supplies. Because the Continental Congress has no way of making money, they have no money to buy weapons, buy artillery, or anything like that. And so they're going to have shortage of ammo, food, clothing, medicine, and it's going to really, really hurt just the lack of money and lack of supplies that the American Army has. And then only 50% of the U.S. even wanted to fight for their independence. Not all colonists supported the Patriot cause. You're going to have neutralists that are not willing to fight, and then you're going to have loyalists that are not willing to fight for the American side. And then probably the biggest disadvantage is that the Americans have no navy. They lacked a real navy, which hurt them because they had no way to defend the coastlines. And it's going to take the help of someone else, or they're going to have to figure out how to get a navy in order to win the war in the end. British advantages. Okay, we know that the Redcoat Army, one of the best armies in the world. They're very disciplined, trained soldiers, much more fighting experience than the colonists. They have the best navy, okay, and the Americans have no navy at all. Okay, so the best Navy, one of the best navies in the world, they could cut off trade and use the ships for transportation, which is going to be a huge advantage for them. They're going to have more resources because England has more money. They're actually able to rent soldiers from Germany, known as Hessians. And then you're going to have loyalists. Some loyalists are going to choose to fight with the Redcoats, and they're able to, give insider information because they have lived near or with some of these patriots that the Redcoats are fighting against. British disadvantages. Okay, they're away from home. These Redcoats, they're basically deployed. They're across seas. So fighting a long distance from home, which made soldiers less effective due to lack of sleep, homesickness, and exhaustion. Fighting style. And their fighting style, they never adapt their fighting style, which will hurt them. And that's because they are overconfident. And they believe that they could just run Americans over without any problem. This underestimation caused them to be unprepared and lose many men in some cases. And then weapons. Their weapons were not as good as the Americans. It took them longer to reload their muskets, and the shooting distance was not as great, and the accuracy was not as great. But overall, looking at advantages and disadvantages, the British should win, no problem. Today we're going to talk about Fort Ticonderoga. So here's a picture of it. Okay, notice that it's built up a little bit to where there's platforms for soldiers up top to shoot off of. All these little, what looks like holes in the wall, are made for cannons. Okay, so like this triangle right here is made for 11 cannons to sit on and shoot, either direction. And then all of these other triangles also have places for cannons. So it has lots of cannons at Fort Ticonderoga. And this is something that the American Army does not have. They have weapons. French are going to send them rifles. Also, most people are going to be fighting with just their weapon they have from home, the rifle that they used to hunt with. They're going to bring that to fight the war with. But they don't really, the average person doesn't have a cannon sitting in their backyard. And so they need artillery. They need cannons. And so if you're not able to make them, you're not able to buy them, how do you get them? You steal them. So that's the plan for the Americans. Try to capture Fort Ticonderoga here. Should be very difficult, okay, because of the fort is built very well. So it should be a tough task in order to try to capture Fort Ticonderoga from the British. So Ticonderoga, the fort, is located here in northeastern New York. So Ethan Allen is the leader of the Green Mountain Boys, which is basically a militia from Vermont. And then you have Benedict Arnold, who is a leader of a militia from Massachusetts of around 400 men. And these two people are going to meet up, and they're going to march to Fort Ticonderoga and try to overtake it. So before sunrise, this is early morning, 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the morning. On May 10th, you have Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold. They march their army, their troops silently to Fort Ticonderoga under darkness. And they get to the fort, and they're trying to figure out how are we going to attack this fort that should be, well defended. And they find out that the front gate is actually open. And that the guard that is guarding that gate is actually asleep. And so, they're very lucky to find this. And so the American Army here, they just march straight in. And they're inside the walls, inside the gate, before the Redcoats even notice. And there are only 42 Redcoats that are guarding Fort Ticonderoga. And with the American Army already inside, they do not even put up a fight. They basically say, we will leave. The Redcoats say, we'll leave. Okay, you can have this fort. Just don't kill us. So the U.S. are able to take over the fort without firing a single shot. So the Americans gained military supplies, which is the main thing they needed. Okay, they gained 78 cannons, 6 mortars, 3 howitzers, and supplies of cannonballs, powder, and flint. So the picture here shows you, a cannon. This is a cannon right here. Shoots pretty flat. So with a cannon, you want to be up on higher ground to improve its distance. A mortar is going to shoot higher up in the air. Okay, and it's going to be made to shoot over tall barriers like walls. And then a howitzer is going to be something in the middle. Now, some of these items, especially the cannons, were transported in the middle of winter to the siege of Boston by Henry Knox. And we'll talk about that in a couple of PowerPoints from now. So now the two big things that happened from capturing Fort Ticonderoga. The most important, number one, the U.S. gains military supplies that they would not be able to afford, that they did not already have. So now they have all these cannons that they're going to be able to use at their expense. Number two, they're going to be able to block off the British transportation route from Canada to the upper U.S. So Quebec was the new, the headquarters in New France early on. After the French and Indian War, the British are going to overtake Canada. And so now there are going to be many redcoats, many resources up in Quebec. And so in order to get those resources, those troops, the redcoats, or their supplies from Quebec and take it to like present-day Boston, like New York, where some of these battles are going to take place, they're going to have to pass along this where Fort Ticonderoga is. And this has been used as like a checkpoint for them getting supplies back and forth and soldiers from Canada, Quebec, down to the Boston area. And now with the U.S. controlling Fort Ticonderoga, it's going to make it more difficult for the British to utilize this pathway. Next, we're going to talk about the Siege of Boston. We're going to talk about it a little bit today, and then we'll talk about it more in a couple of lessons from now. So after Concord, Minutemen chased the Redcoats back to Boston. So the last PowerPoint we left off, it was the Battle of Lexington, Concord, okay, which were basically draws. But then on the way back to Boston, that is when there are going to be 4,000 Minutemen lining the road and basically spraying bullets into the Redcoats as they run back to Boston trying to get back to safety. So once they get back to Boston, there's going to be patriots that are going to hear about the shot heard around the world that are going to grab their rifles and head to Boston to help. So you're going to have people all over the 13 colonies that are going to get on their horse, and they're going to leave their home and head north to the Boston area to try to help the patriot cause. And so with all these extra Minutemen there in Boston or outside of Boston, they're going to place a siege on Boston. Now, what's a siege? Okay, this is surrounding Boston with soldiers, and they're going to try to cut off all supplies. Now, the problem is Boston is built on a peninsula, and it is a major port city, and so the British are still able to get boats, their navy, in and out of Boston. So this siege is really not successful at all early on. Okay, and it's not going to be successful until the Americans find a way to block off the port and basically do not allow the British ships in or out of the harbor of Boston. Until then, the siege is really ineffective. Now, you should have the siege tactic in military history has been very successful. Santa Anna uses it at the Alamo. Okay, they'll use it later on at Vicksburg. So it's a tactic that is pretty common and is very successful when you can completely cut off all supplies. Right now, the siege of Boston, they are not able to cut off all supplies, not yet. So going back to the last slide, so here's Boston on a peninsula here. Okay, so the Patriots are able to cut off basically the land that gets to Boston. So they're able to put soldiers here and soldiers around the coast here and cut off the Redcoats from going inland. But the Redcoats are able to use their navy and get ships in and out right here of the Boston harbor. And so the Americans need to find a way in order to cut this off. But the problem is they have no navy. So next we're going to talk about the Battle of Bunker Hill. And surprisingly, it actually happens on Breed's Hill. So I know it doesn't make any sense at all. Okay, but here's Bunker Hill, and then here's Breed's Hill here. So Breed's Hill is closer to Boston. So if you look at the zoomed out picture, this would be Breed's Hill here. Bunker Hill happens back here. So the Battle of Bunker Hill actually happens on Breed's Hill. So the U.S. Colonel William Prescott is the commander of the American forces at Bunker Hill. His army is going to set up on Breed's Hill under darkness, just across the harbor from Boston. And they're trying to bait the Redcoats into attacking. So if we go back here, Prescott's army was back here a little bit, okay, away from Boston. And under darkness, they're going to get on the Charlestown Peninsula and move closer to Boston by getting on top of Breed's Hill here. And they do this at night. And that night, 1,500 Patriots are going to fortify Breed's Hill, meaning they're going to basically turn it into a fort. They're going to do this by digging trenches and using cotton and hay bales for protection. And Prescott is trying to bait the Redcoats of Boston into attacking. And the next morning, as the sun comes up, the Redcoats wake up in Boston and they can see to the north that here is the American army on top of Breed's Hill. And the British decide to attack, even though they don't have the high ground. And in military, high ground normally wins. They do not have the high ground. Okay, Prescott and the Americans do. But the Redcoats, they're overconfident. We said that earlier. They're overconfident. They're ready to get redemption from what happened at Lexington and Concord. They're ready to retaliate on the on these Patriots. And so they're anxious to fight. So they load up on a ship. They leave Boston. They work over to the Charlestown Peninsula, and they get in their rows at the bottom of the hill, and they're ready to charge up the hill at Prescott. So now the British are going to be led by General William Howe, and he has about 2,400 Redcoats. And the Redcoats are going to launch 2 uphill assaults, and they're both unsuccessful. And that's because, it's tough. These Redcoats are lining up in a straight line, and they're going to sprint up a hill, which is difficult. And when they're looking up at the Americans, all they can see is basically their shoulders and their head. Everything else is going to be blocked by these dirt mounds, these cotton bales. So the Americans are entrenched. They have, this wall, this dirt wall in front of them, this barrier, these cotton bales, these hay bales. And so the Americans have a huge advantage. So not only are the Redcoats running up a hill, they're trying to aim their inaccurate rifles and try to hit a small target. Where the Americans are sitting at the top of the hill, they're not running at all. Okay, they're just letting the British run to them. So they're not exhausted. And they have, they're sitting behind a wall and they're shooting at the Redcoats. And from the higher ground, they're able to see the entire body of the Redcoats. So their shots are going to be much more accurate. Now, after 2 unsuccessful charges, the Americans are running low on gunpowder. And so General Prescott knows this, so he tells his men, don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes. Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes. And what he means by that is let them get close. Do not shoot when they're halfway down the hill. Let them get close enough where you can see the whites in their eyes, and then you can shoot. And this is one way to conserve gunpowder. You're not going to waste shots at long distances that are going to be, with these inaccurate rifles. Let them get close, and now you're more likely to hit them, and your bullet is more likely to do more damage when they're close. And so that's what he tells his Patriots. Now, Howe, before this third attempt, before the third charge, Howe is going to wait at the bottom of the hill. They've already made two attempts up the hill. Neither one worked. So they get to the bottom, they regather in their lines, and they're going to wait for 400 more Redcoats to be shipped over from Boston. And so once the 400 more Redcoats arrive, they're going to make a third and final attempt up this hill. Now, by this time, you would think, well, the Redcoats would be smart enough to, do something else. Don't charge uphill. You're at a disadvantage. The Redcoats, though, they're overconfident. They want retaliation, and they're not willing to give up on this battle. They're not willing to lose because they already lost at Lexington and Concord, and they're overconfident. So they're going to fight until they take the hill. Prescott knows that they're running out of gunpowder, so he tells his men on the third charge that we're going to shoot and then we're going to retreat. And we're going to retreat back, run back to Bunker Hill, and allow the British to take the hill. So they do that. So in the end, the results of Bunker Hill, yes, the British overtake the hill. The Americans are forced to retreat. The Americans are forced to quit fighting. But so in the terms of battle, really the Redcoats win because they overtake the hill. The Americans are forced to retreat. The Americans are the one that quit. But yet you look at the numbers here, and there are over 1,000 Redcoat casualties. And there are only 270 American casualties. A casualty is someone that dies, is injured, or has gone missing. So the Americans dominate the battle, yet they still technically lose because they retreated. But this is still a major moral victory. It's a moral victory for the Americans, even though they lost the battle. So the battle served to prove to the American people that the British Army was not invincible, and under the undertrained, undermanned, and undersupplied Continental Army could stand up to the superior British Army. So let's review what's a siege. That's cutting off all supplies by surrounding it. Who were the main generals? You got General Howe, General Prescott. How many times did the British march up Breed's Hill before they finally captured it? That is 3. And then why was this battle considered a moral victory for the Americans? That's because they realized that the Redcoats were not invincible and that they, number-wise, they dominated the Redcoats.